Hyssop.
Yeah.
It's an herb that was used for cleansing in the Bible. Um, so there's a famous line in Psalm 50: "You shall
Yes.
sprinkle me with hyssop, and I'll be cleansed. You shall wash me, and I'll be made white and so." I think it's like a branch with leaves, and it was used for clean. I could be wrong about that,
Okay.
but it was an herb associated with cleaning. That's what it was. Um, okay, so welcome, everybody, to our catechetical class. We're going to be talking more about the Orthodox faith and the Orthodox view of the world. And now, we're really getting into the meat of everything. So, what we said last class is that we talked about, what is a religion? And we said that a religion, it's kind of hard to define, right? Because not all religions have gods, not all religions have afterlives, but there's some unifying factor that makes religion. That's how we can all identify it. And we said that the religion at its core is a solution to a problem. Religion is a solution to a problem. So everyone wakes up, they look outside, they look at the world, whether it's the physical world or whether it's just human affairs, and they say something is not right here. Everyone kind of instinctively has that sense. Something is not right about the world. Religion is an attempt to diagnose the problem, usually in light of a revelation of some kind, and to propose a solution. So we said, like, for instance, the Buddhists look around, they see the world, the problem is suffering. And so they propose that the problem of all existence is suffering. What's the solution? Well, it's to extinguish desire. Because without desire, there's no suffering. So extinguishing desire, then you achieve nirvana. Likewise, we said the Confucians, they look around, they say the problem is disharmony. And by the way, these are all partly right, we would say, from an Orthodox perspective. It's not that they're 100% completely, absolutely fake and wrong. Obviously, suffering is part of the problem of the world. The Confucians look around and they say the problem of the world is disharmony. So they're very upset, preoccupied with relationships. That's why, proper relations of a subject, of a ruler to a subject, proper relations of husbands to wives. That's why, Confucian influenced societies like Chinese society, Korea, and so on are very hierarchical and very focused on, right relationships within families and within society, because it's trying to restore the harmony of the universe. And we said that the Orthodox perspective is the problem with the world is sin and death. That is to say, the problem in the world is the fall. We believe that at some point in the ancient primordial past, sin and death were not originally part of our world, and they entered our world because of mankind's sin. So through Adam and Eve, through our ancient forebears, sin and death became part of our world. Originally, we were meant to live in paradise, in sort of bliss, in direct communion with God. And because of what happened with our ancestors, and we said we do read Genesis literally, we do and we don't, right? We do believe that there really was an Adam and Eve, that there was a real event called the fall. At the same time, we're not rigidly literalistic, right? Did the snake, talk to them verbally? Well, I don't know. The snake was the devil. But it does refer to a real event that occurred in the historical past. So we said the problem, and then sin and death entered our world. And I think this tracks very much like with our own experience. We all experience very deeply that the world is not right. We all experience all of the problems all of us experience are either sin or death. When I look at my own life, the two problems I have are sin, either that I commit, the things that are wrong with me, or that other people commit against me. Likewise, death, the propensity of my body to decay and break down, and the fact that I'm going to die one day, and the fact that I can get sicknesses and disease. This is all part of death. So this is the problem with the world as far as we see it. And I think it's very real, very existential. I mean, these are real features of the real world. It's not just some kind of abstract or vague mythology. I think this really is the story of every one of us and the story of our world collectively. Okay, so that's just a recap of what we learned last time, because I know not everyone was here. But yesterday we learned about the fall of mankind, um, and we said that the fall of mankind was outlined in Genesis chapter 3. So, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, you have the creation of human beings described. And we said, human beings, what was so noteworthy about them is that they were created in the image of God. They were imparted this characteristics that separated them from all other animal life, which is that they somehow bear the characteristics of God in them. And we said previously, well, what are the characteristics of God? Okay, I'm sorry. We'll be in touch. Um, what are the characteristics? What are the characteristics of God? Well, it's a couple of things. It's the capacity for abstract thought and speech. It is moral agency and free will. It is dominion over the earth. These are all dimensions of the fact that we are in the image of God, and these are things that no other living animal has, right? No, we're not really competing with chimpanzees or bears for territory. We're running the whole show. We're not. No dolphin has ever produced a monograph on calculus or something like that. It's all human beings. Okay. But anyway, so yesterday we learned about last class we learned about the fall of mankind. However, and we talked about the specific curses that were put on human beings. So, like human beings were meant to have this easy, perfect life in paradise, but now human beings are cursed to work for their food. Life after the fall. Life before the fall was easy, effortless. Life after the fall requires effort. It's difficult, and there's a lot of sorrow in our life, and we have to work to supply ourselves with things. We said that reproduction is different than it would have been if we hadn't fallen, right? Human reproduction it's at its core, it's beautiful, and the creation of a new life is a beautiful thing. But at the same time, as it is in this fallen world, reproduction involves risk, it involves pain, and it disadvantages women very significantly. So these are all part of the curse that God laid on mankind. However, even when God pronounced a curse on mankind, we noticed that that wasn't the end of the story. So when God is pronouncing the curse on the serpent, which again is a curse on the devil, this is his it says the curse that God put on the serpent was that it would crawl on its belly in the dust of the ground. That's not talking about literal snakes, guys. It's talking about Satan being cast into the depths of the earth, and again, not necessarily the physical earth, but the lower part of the cosmos, which is Hades. So the serpent being cast to the earth is Satan being cast into hell. And when God pronounces that curse, he says to the Satan, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall be on guard for his heel. So this is where the animosity between mankind and the demons began. And nevertheless, he says that the seed of the woman, that is to say, one of Eve's descendants, is going to come and squash your head. So Eve is going to give birth to a descendant who's going to crush you. And this is referring to Jesus Christ. This is a prophecy of the coming of the Messiah. And nevertheless, you shall bruise his heel. So even when the Messiah comes and crushes the devil, he's going to be wounded in the process. And of course, now, hindsight's 2020. Now we know that to be the crucifixion. Before, which seemed to be the ultimate victory of the devil, right? The Son of God failed, or he appeared to have failed in his mission to mankind. There's no worse sign of failure than this sort of ignominious death on a cross in shame. What's going on? Sorry, he's not here. So it seemed to be the ultimate victory of the devil, but in fact it was the ultimate victory of God. It's very, the crucifixion is so profound, so beautiful. That's not what we're talking about in this class, but it's really, really remarkable. But yesterday, but even when God was pronouncing the curses on mankind, that wasn't going to be the final story. Even though God cursed us, that was the necessary consequence for our sin, right? Just like, something almost like the law of gravity. If I drop this, it's going to fall, right? Likewise, if you turn your back on God, you're going to be cursed. It's not, out of God's hatred or his desire to destroy mankind, but it's simply the logical consequence of the actions we chose to take. Nevertheless, that was never going to be the final story, because even when he pronounced the curse, he's saying that I have a plan in place. I have plan B. I have plan B, and I'm still going to get these people into paradise. So God's fundamental desire was always to bring human beings to himself. And this is at the core of how we understand God and his character, right? So yes, God does punish. God does have wrath. God does allow us to reap the consequence of what we sow. But over and above all of that is God's mercy and his love for us. And there's no possible way to be, all of us were going to go through difficulties from God in our life, because of our sins and because of things we choose to do. But overall, that's only going to be part of his redemption arc for us, at least as long as we choose to allow it to be such. So God's fundamental desire is always to bring human beings to himself. His mercy overrides every other consideration in the final analysis. Again, the way the process plays out isn't always fun, but the end result is always good and beautiful. So what is how did God's process unfold? This process unfold in history? Well, note first of all that it did unfold in history. That all of the events of human history are part of God's plan of salvation. This our faith is not just some extra add-on to the history of the world, but God's plan is fundamentally at the core of all of the development of human society and human history. This is what everything was pointing towards. And the generations following from Adam and Eve, we can say, were God's process of cultivating mankind through, and there was a very distinct pattern from Noah through Abraham and his descendants to make the world ready for his ultimate act. We see there's always this process of a bunch of people are here on the earth. God takes the best, we're talking about before the coming of Christ now. God takes the best remnant of those people and uses them to perpetuate their lineage and keeps taking the best out of them. So what am I saying? So out of all the children of Adam and Eve, the world got so terribly corrupt, right? We know that before the flood of Noah, the world was a really nasty place. It was filled with violence. And out of all of the people who lived on earth, God chose Noah and his family to sort of purify the human race. And so he brings them through the flood when, again, human beings get the consequences of their evil actions. He calls the righteous people out. He calls a righteous remnant out from the great mass of human being to perpetuate the lineage that's going to lead to the Messiah, who's going to be the seed of the woman who crushes the serpent's head. So out of that whole remnant, he takes Noah. Out of the remnant of Noah's descendants, he chooses Abraham. Out of Abraham's seed, he chooses Moses, and so on and so forth. God is continually taking the cream of the human lineage and using that to move toward to the coming of Christ in the world. Now, throughout this process of cultivation, there's a continuous, repeated pattern. So one of the really cool things about the Bible, and one of the really interesting things about human history, is the way you see God's fingerprints in it, because you see the same patterns coming up over and over again. You see the whole Bible, the whole story of salvation history is one big pattern. It's the creation of the world is good, its fall into descent, into sin and catastrophe, and then its redemption. That is the story of the Bible from Genesis through Revelation. And at the same time, you see that same micro pattern playing out again and again and again. What am I saying? So, God establishes mankind. They fall. He brings. He does not abandon mankind, nevertheless, and so we have Abel and Cain and the building of cities and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, the whole world descends into sin. So there's another kind of mini fall, and yet there's a redemption through Noah in the flood. So and then you have it again where Joseph is born to Jacob. Things are good, he's the most beloved of all his brothers, but there's a fall into sin, right? Joseph's brothers sell him as a slave into Egypt. He goes into Egypt, he experiences a lot of trials, but nevertheless, he actually rises through the ranks, becomes the Grand Vizier of Egypt, and then becomes a source of redemption for all his brothers. So you have this creation is good, fall, and ultimate redemption, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger. At first, it's just Joseph saving his family. Then you have the Israelites. Things are going well in Egypt. They're actually, respected in Egypt, and they have a good thing going for a couple of generations, and then they become slaves. A new Pharaoh rises up who does not know Joseph and his brothers. He enslaves the Jews, and then God, out of them, raises up Moses, and he takes his people out of Egypt and gives them the promised land. So things start good in Egypt, there's a fall, and then there's a redemption where God brings about something even better. Why? Because he gives them their own kingdom in the promised land. So this pattern of creation, fall, fall/exile, and redemption repeats itself over and over. And that's how you see God's fingerprints in something. Once you see these repeating patterns, you say, okay, I recognize this. I recognize kind of who's responsible here. This is just, these are just a couple of examples I picked out. You find this all over the Bible, and this is not nearly the only repeating motif in the Bible. It's really, really fascinating. And this is when so God's So, and each time, or many of the times, that God brings about this pattern of fall, of creation, fall, and redemption, he's moving history forward. He introduces something new. So after Moses is after Moses in the flood, after Moses is saved from the flood, and the ark lands and the world is dried off, God introduces the Noahide covenant. So God gives his first set of commands so then God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, I am establishing my covenant with you and with your seed after you, and every living creature with you, the birds, the cattle, and all the wild animals on earth, and all that came out of the ark with you. Thus I will establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, nor shall there ever be again a flood to destroy the earth. Then the Lord God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you, and every living creature with you for perpetual generations. I am setting my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth, the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature and of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. My rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will certainly remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh on the earth. And God gives a set of commandments to Noah and his descendants called the Noahide covenant, telling them not to murder, not to commit sexual immorality. Likewise, when Moses brings the Israelites out of Egypt, it's an opportunity for God to reveal the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. That's where we get the 10 Commandments. So each time humanity goes through this process, it's not just like this pointless cycle that's repeating. Every time humankind goes through this process, God reveals a little more about himself and a little more about his will for the world, right? So that's why his commandments through each of these cycles, right, become more and more detailed. So first we have the Noahide covenant, which is very general and applies to all mankind. Then we have the Torah and the 613 commandments, of which the 10 are the chief, revealed to the children of Israel. Likewise, when Jesus comes and brings about the ultimate redemption, he brings even more commandments, which reveal more fully God's will for mankind. So this pattern is a pattern of purification of humankind. It is a pattern of preparing human beings to be able to receive more and more and more about God. And I think that's like something that plays out in our spiritual lives. Like we come to know God better and better as we go through our own arcs of fall and redemption. There are things I learn or it feels like I understand things more deeply that 10 years ago, even though I was already living a religious life then, I wasn't ready for. But because certain events happen in my life, God acts in certain ways in my life. He brings me to a point where I can understand new things and I can enter, God willing, more deeply into my relationship with him. And I think that's part of all of what's going on. So the same pattern that's playing out in history is the pattern that's playing out in our individual lives. Like it's all connected. It's fractals all the way down. Fractals, like it's a pattern. It's the same pattern on different levels of magnification. I think that's really very true about like God's will playing out in history. Okay. So God gives Abraham's descendants knowledge of himself, monotheism, and his commandments, Torah, so that he could create a righteous and holy lineage culminating in Mary. And then in Jesus. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I pulled the rug out from you under that. But yeah, because Mary is the ultimate human being who is just a human being, right? Jesus Christ supersedes her, obviously, because he's God. You can't really compete with that. But she and we'll talk more about her in the next class. But she's sort of the cream of humanity. She's the greatest human being who ever lived, who is just a human being. Okay, everything God did in Israel's history was a preparation and foreshadowing of Christ, particularly by instituting the messianic offices priest, prophet, and king. So as God is revealing more and more about himself, he's revealing more and more of his commandments. It's true that most of the time, most people are not following most of these commandments, right? And there are these kind of continual falls. There are these kind of continual degenerations of mankind. However, in every generation, there's a holy remnant. There's a lineage of people who are faithful to God. And it's out of this lineage that God is bringing Mary and that he's going to bring Jesus. So it's not a waste. And that's something important I think we should see. We look around in the Christian world, we look around even in the Orthodox Church, and we say, most people are not taking this seriously. Most people are not living their orthodoxy to 100%. And that's kind of part of the plan. That's kind of how that's how things have always been. It's always been a faithful remnant. Now, of course, it's not saying it's completely a waste for all those other people too. God is working for them, and He's, God willing, bringing about their redemption as well. But God's operation in history has always been bringing together a faithful remnant, that even when most people most of the time are unfaithful to Him, they're people who obtain to true knowledge of Him and obtain to true practice of His commandments. And that's what's happening in Israel's history as well. So, so there's something about these commandments being revealed and these commandments being enacted in history that is preparing the groundwork for Jesus Christ to come. We can't flesh it out in full detail, but there's something about all of this having been revealed that made it possible for Jesus Christ to come and for Him to be understood when He came. The Israelites had to have achieved a certain level of knowledge in order to be able to make sense of who Jesus Christ was and what He's doing. And in particular, Jesus Christ, all of Israel's history was a preparation for and also a foreshadowing of Christ, particularly by the institution of the messianic offices, the priest, the prophet, and the king. So within God's unfolding plan for human history, He's establishing certain concepts and certain roles that are going to help us understand better who Jesus Christ is when He finally comes. And these are priest, prophet, and king. So the first we can say is a prophet. Now, what's a prophet? Does anyone want to hazard a guess to how would one define a prophet? Yes.
One who brings about God's word.
Beautiful. You got the right answer. And because there was a wrong answer that I was waiting for someone to say and I was going to pounce on them. Because most people assume that a prophet is someone who predicts the future. And that is part of what prophets do. But in reality, a prophet is just one who speaks on behalf of God. A prophet is one who speaks on behalf of God. If you read the actual prophets in the Old Testament, most of the time they're not predicting the future. Even though nowadays prophecies become associated with, Nostradamus prophecy, he said that, Napoleon was going to come and 9/11, whatever, maybe. But most of the time, if you actually read the prophets in the Bible, and that's the thing, like no one actually reads the Bible. It's an unfortunate state of affairs. People have a lot of opinions about the Bible, but people often have a very loose familiarity with it. If you actually read the Bible, most of what they're doing is just condemning Israel for their sin. Most of what the prophets are doing throughout the Old Testament is just trying to get people back on the right track. They're speaking on behalf of God. That's what prophecy is. Sometimes that means predicting the future, and they're real prophets when they accurately predict the future, because only God can accurately predict the future. But a prophet is someone who speaks for God and calls others to knowledge of and obedience to God. Throughout the Old Testament, you see the Israelites are reminding the prophets of Israel are reminding the Israelites that there's only one God who's worthy of worship. There's only oftentimes the Israelites they break off into polytheism and they start bowing down to Baal and all the other Canaanite deities that are in their local milieu, and it falls on the prophets to remind them that there's only one God who's worthy of worship. Now we're not monotheists in the sense that we say only one God exists. There are other gods out there, but gods with a small g, and they're demons. But they do live and act. They're actual spiritual beings. So the prophets remind us of the true knowledge of God and obedience to God. Now, in what way is Christ? If a prophet is someone who speaks for God, in what way is Christ the ultimate prophet? Should be an easy question. He's the Word of God. He speaks for God better than anyone else, because He is God made flesh. No one can speak better on someone's behalf than that person themselves or their Son. Remember, God. So oftentimes when we say God in the Bible, we mean God the Father. And God the Son is one of the Godhead, but He's distinct within the Godhead. He's distinct from the Father. So yes, Jesus Christ, actually, according to the Gospel of St. John, Jesus Christ is the Word of God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. He is God's self. What is the Word? Your Word is your self-expression. It's an expression of what's in you. When I speak to you, I'm only speaking from what's in myself. When God speaks, He speaks forth His Son. He speaks of His own essence. He speaks of His own character and His own being. So Jesus, as the Word of God, communicates God's very self to us. And so that's why Jesus is the ultimate prophet. However, notice, you need this sort of tradition of prophets for generations leading up to Christ in order to understand what a prophet is. In order to properly understand who Jesus is, you need kind of to see this archetype foreshadowing him in the person of Elijah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and so on and so forth. So so they had their own messages to communicate when they were here, but their primary role was to prepare mankind for a proper understanding of Jesus Christ's role and character. Likewise, another messianic office which gets instituted is the office of the priesthood. What is a priest? What does a priest do?
Is it a shepherd?
No. Sorry, that was rude. But no, priest is not a shepherd. Although offer sacrifice. Yes, exactly. The fundamental core function of a priest that differentiates them from any other type of person is a priest offers a sacrifice. A priest stands between man and God, offering a sacrifice on behalf of man. And so the priests in the Israelite religion, and I do distinguish ancient Israelite from religion, the religion of Christ's time, from what is now called Judaism, because they're actually distinctly different. And what's now called Judaism went through a massive evolution starting between the 2nd and 5th centuries, to the point it's rather significantly different. But so a priest cleanses and sanctifies the people through sacrifice. That's the entire function of the priests in the Old Testament. If you read like the book of Leviticus, there are all kinds of incredibly detailed instructions on how you cut up the animal and you offer this part of the animal to God, and then this part of the animal the priests eat, and you offer the cakes and you offer the drink libations to God. It was really intensely focused on sacrifice, and of course another important part of that was purifying the people. In order to enter into the presence of God, people were falling into uncleanness all the time. We've talked about uncleanness in our Bible study. It's not the same as sin, but it's connected to sin. Uncleanness is a state of being tainted by the fall, let's say, tainted by death, tainted by the impurity that entered our world because of Adam and Eve's sin. So priests also had the function of cleansing people who became unclean. Now, in what way is Christ the ultimate priest?
He offered himself.
He offered the ultimate sacrifice. Yeah, exactly. So if the function of a priest is to offer a sacrifice, the ultimate priest is the one who offers the ultimate sacrifice, right? He offered, and St. Paul details this very clearly in this epistle to the Hebrews, which says, the Israelites were constantly offering bulls and lambs, and that was important for the cleansing of the people and, to atone for their sins. However, they had to re-offer them every single day. And throughout the year, they had to keep offering these sacrifices. Christ's sacrifice is fundamentally different because he offered something of infinite value, himself. Therefore, the sacrifice never need be repeated. He once and for all offered himself on the cross. Now, what are we doing in the Divine Liturgy? Are we repeating Christ's sacrifice? No, but we are entering into it again. Every time we gather for Divine Liturgy and we offer the bread and wine to God, we are entering into what happened 2,000 years ago, in a real sense, albeit a very mysterious sense. So it's not just merely symbolic, and it's not a reenacting of it, but it's really an entering into of it. But Christ is the ultimate priest because he gave the ultimate and most acceptable sacrifice, sufficient to make men perfect, right? So if the blood of bulls and lambs and goats could cleanse you temporarily, the blood of the Son of God could cleanse you permanently. And we see, and notice that there's a symbolic connection here that's helping the Israelites to understand who Jesus Christ is when he comes, right? Just like the Passover lamb, its blood was smeared on the doors. I'm assuming you guys have some familiarity with the Old Testament. I'm sorry, I know that's not always a given, but it would take too long to explain the book of Exodus right now. So if you don't understand, that's okay. All of us have different, but go and watch The Prince of Egypt when you get home. It's the Passover lamb, when the Israelites smeared the blood of the Passover lamb on their door, the angel of death knew not to enter their house and to take their firstborn and to kill it. Likewise, when we smear the blood of the ultimate Passover lamb, who is Jesus Christ himself, on the doors of our body, that is to say our lips, then the angel of death knows not to come and get us because we'll live forever with Christ. So notice that the symbolic language of sacrifice sheds light and understanding on who Christ is. The sacrificial system needed to come earlier in history in order for Christ to be understood when he came. All of this was a foreshadowing and a preparation for Jesus Christ's redemptive work. So Christ is the ultimate priest because he offered the ultimate sacrifice. And finally, Christ is and Christ fulfills the office of king. Remember, there were God-anointed kings in the Old Testament. Saul being the first one, and then David, and then Solomon were the only kings of the united monarchy. And then you had later kings of Israel and kings of Judah who were anointed by God. In what way is Christ the ultimate king?
He's the one that we answer to.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. He's the one he answered. He's the one who's really in charge. I mean, if a king is kind of judged by his ability to exercise power, who exercises more power really than the creator of the universe? Jesus Christ, the ultimate power he exercised was, of course, conquering death. Like, he came back from the dead. Yes.
I was going to say, arguably, the king is like a good father of his family.
Right.
Discipline, love.
That's a really good point. An important dimension of kingship, at least when it's done right, is a king has a paternal relation to his subjects. At least that's kind of the ideal laid out in the Bible. And that's right. And so Christ is the ultimate king, not just in terms of power, but in terms of virtue. He not only is a really, really powerful king, but he does kingship right by loving and guiding his people and not just exploiting them and extracting them. Because I think we Americans, with a legacy of 1776, we say all kings are bad, all kings are tyrants, and we have a negative there were no kings protests a few months ago. I'm not commenting on that movement at all, but just like the concept that kings are categorically negative. In the Bible, they're not. In the Bible, they're mostly bad. Like, so out of 40 kings in the Bible, how many were good? Do you guys know off the top of your head? It's about 8. Last time I checked, I could be wrong. So it's about 20% of kings, of God-anointed kings in the Bible, were actually good. And even of them, only a subset was really good. Like, there were 4, like Josiah, Hezekiah, Solomon, and David, and even they were problematic in various ways. But Christ is the ultimate king, both ruling over the universe and passing judgment impartially, as well as showering his people with love, and overall having a paternal relation to his subjects. Okay, are there any questions, comments, concerns about the threefold office of priest, prophet, and king? These things had to exist in history before the coming of Christ in order to help us understand the character and purpose of Christ's mission. Okay. There is one more dimension. This is not coming from the book that we're reading, but this is just coming from my own speculation, my own interest. It's really kind of interesting that throughout human history, this is something that, obviously the ultimate models of priesthood, prophecy, and kingship are in the Israelite people, right? Are among Hebrew culture and in the Bible. However, it's really kind of remarkable that there are sort of things that are human universals, right? So even when you come to South America, when Europeans colonized, they had priests, they had kings. These concepts were not foreign to them. You can go in Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa. These are concepts that are relatively universal among human beings. Now, they take on very different dimensions, right? The Aztecs were offering human sacrifices, and we say that's generally quite a bad thing. And most kings throughout history were despots, not ruling their subjects paternally, but ruling their subjects extractively. Nevertheless, these kinds of concepts were present in all human societies to a certain degree. And I think, there's partly a historical reason. I think all human beings were descendants of Noah, so it kind of tracks that human beings would have these civilizational features in common. But it's really noteworthy because I think it speaks to God's acting in every human society to prepare all people for accepting Jesus Christ. Remember, like the early church, they always assimilated, in general, when the early Christians got to a new society, they would assimilate as much of the ancient religion as they could in order to teach people about Christ. So famously, in Acts chapter 17, St. Paul actually quotes a poem that's about Zeus and uses it to refer to God the Father, to kind of show, hey, listen, you guys were on the right track, but here's the fulfillment of what you were looking for, or what kind of was in your civilizational memory, because it was ultimately coming down by God's work. But it's interesting, because what am I saying? Because if we take a naturalistic view, if we take like sort of an atheistic view and say that, religion was just something people came up with, it's kind of interesting that these patterns play out again and again and again in societies across place and time. Like if It was truly something. If the idea of priesthood, why do most societies throughout history have some kind of concept of sacrifice, of temples, of priests? If this was something that just a certain group of people came up at a certain point of time, you would expect some civilizations to have it, but most not to have it. But in fact, it seems to play out across the world. Even their temples, in many places look rather similar. I think this speaks to God's acting in every human civilization, because it was said that God entrusted all human societies like to angels, right? And some of them, fell and became demons. But God was guiding all humanity to the knowledge of priesthood, prophecy, and kingship, so they could accept the ultimate priest, prophet, and king. Okay, that's a little more speculative, but I'm having fun. Okay, so can we get to our packets? We're going to read them all together. All right. The fathers speak. The lyre of the prophets who proclaimed him, singing before him, and the hyssop of the priests who loved him, eagerly desiring his presence, and the diadem of kings who handed it down in succession belong to the Lord of virgins, for even his mother is a virgin. He who is king gives the kingdom to all. He who is priest gives pardon to all. He who is the Lamb gives nourishment to all. Let his mother worship him. Let her offer him a crown, for Solomon's mother made him king and crowned him. He apostatized and lost his crown in battle. Behold, the son of David who glorified and crowned the house of David. For you have greatly magnified his throne, you have exalted his tribe, and his lyre you have extended everywhere. So this is just kind of showing that this concept of priesthood, prophethood, and kingship as applied to Christ is, comes from the ancient church. St. Ephrem the Syrian was writing in the 4th century. But he's the ultimate, exemplar of human aspirations, of human ideals. These are all noble things to be a priest, a prophet, or a king, and Jesus exemplifies them in the ultimate sense. So even though human kings failed, right? Solomon failed. Solomon, if you actually read the Bible, Solomon seems like he ends kind of badly. He kind of ends in idolatry and kind of ends in apostasy, despite all of his wisdom. Now, I think there's extra biblical tradition that maybe he kind of got his act together by the end of his life, but still, it's problematic. Okay. So even though, and now St. Nicholas Cabasilas, even though in Scripture there are many righteous men and friends of God before the coming of the justifier and reconciler, we ought to consider this both in the particular context of their own generation and also with reference to that which was to come. It was for this that they were enabled and prepared, that when the light would shine, they would see it, and when the reality had been disclosed, they would rise above types and shadows. So there it is, in one sentence. It was for this that they were enabled and prepared, that when the light would shine, they would see it. All of this was a preparation that human beings would have the conceptual, mental, and spiritual resources to be able to properly receive Christ when he came. Okay. Special study, typology. We have spoken of certain Old Testament persons or events as being types of something revealed in the New Testament. We note that the exodus of the Jews from Egypt was a type of the deliverance of mankind from sin by the blood of Christ. So remember, that's what I was saying about the blood. The blood on the doorway saved the Israelites from death. The blood of the Lamb on you, that is to say, Jesus Christ, saves you from death. Of course, always in typology, it's a movement from the more specific and historical to the more general and cosmic. So what the Israelites experienced was just for them at that point in time. What Jesus Christ offers for us is more universal. It applies, God willing, to all human beings at all times. But what exactly is a type, and why does the church interpret the scriptures in this way? Typology is a method of biblical interpretation whereby certain persons or events, usually in the Old Testament, are seen as signs or foreshadowing of either heavenly realities or future events. This method of interpretation was employed by Christ himself when he cited Jonah's 3-day sojourn in the belly of the great fish as a sign of his own 3-day burial. In the book of Hebrews, the priest Melchizedek, to whom Abraham offered a tenth of his goods, is cited as a type of Christ, the great high priest of our salvation. Typology is very similar to the literary technique of foreshadowing. Let us suppose that the author of a novel has his main character die in the final chapter by being hit by a car on the deserted country road. Let us also suppose that in an earlier chapter, the main character comes upon a dead animal, obviously hit by a car on a deserted country road, and that in order to avoid the animal, he swerves off the road and damages his car. Because of this minor accident, he misses an important meeting, and the course of his life is altered. The dead animal in the road has a specific function in the development of the plot up to that point. We might have no reason to suspect that the animal carcass has any other meaning. When, however, we read the last chapter and learn that the main character is killed by being hit by a car on a deserted country road, we think back to the dead animal in the earlier chapter. It's a very interesting example he uses to cite, but nevertheless, I think you guys get the point. The author could have used any excuse to keep the main character from getting to his meeting. His car could have simply broken down, he could have had a minor accident with another car at a busy intersection, or he could have swerved to miss a large tree limb in the middle of the road. Instead, the author chose to foreshadow the death of the main character by using an animal that also had been hit by a car. While the actual text of the Bible was written by men, the true author of this story is God himself. Indeed, he is both the author and the main character. Throughout the history of Israel, God was preparing Israel and the world for the coming of his Son. When the Son was finally revealed in human flesh, the eternal significance of the history of Israel came to light. The Jews whom Moses led out of Egypt had no indication that their exodus meant anything more than their escape from physical bondage. However, its real significance was not understood until the coming of Christ, who delivered all mankind from the bondage of sin and death through the shedding of his own blood. The Church interprets all of the Holy Scripture, both Old and New Testaments, in the light of Christ, and typology is the primary method used. 2 points need to be clarified, however. First, because God is both the author and main character, the types do more than simply foreshadow. In some way, they actually participate in the event being typified. When Israel escaped from Egypt, she was participating, again in a very limited way, in the deliverance of Christ. Finally, we may understand that typology is different from allegory. Allegory is a method of interpretation also used by the apostles and church fathers, whereby a moral or philosophical point is extracted from a story without regard to its literal meaning. These two types of interpretation are not mutually exclusive. The fathers teach that a passage may have a literal, typological, and allegorical meaning at the same time. For example, the story of the Exodus refers to the literal deliverance of Israel from bondage in Egypt. It is also a type of the deliverance wrought by Christ on the cross, another historical event. Finally, it may also be interpreted as allegory, as deliverance of the soul from sin. The latter method is used frequently during Great Lent, when the hymnographers invite us to put ourselves in the place of the Old Testament characters and see their struggles as an allegory of our own personal spiritual journey. Okay, so I just want to emphasize, because when I first started, learning the Bible and I first got exposed to this stuff, I didn't know that much about typology, and it didn't mean that much to me. Now I'm actually blown away by it. Because the more you familiarize yourself with the Bible, the more you realize how many of these themes are repeated again and again, and how much they mirror each other. But what's really crazy about this is that the various books of the Bible, like what we read about Passover, was recorded in 1200 BC. And it is a perfect analog for the sacrifice of Christ in 0 AD. These books are written in cultures massively separated by each other in time, and even by language, and yet they sync up so well in depth of meaning that it really does speak to the divine authorship. It really speaks to something greater than human that's behind these stories, and that just continue. And once you really get into the Bible, you see it everywhere. This kind of stuff is all over the place. It really is awesome. And so I just encourage you to just keep exploring the Bible. Yeah.
Is it just the Septuagint? Didn't some of this stuff get taken out later?
Yeah, so you have a couple discrete situations where the Greek text of the Old Testament is more amenable to a Christian interpretation, and the Hebrew text is less amenable to a Christian interpretation, specifically in specific instances like Psalm 22 or something. And it was historically a back and forth. The Christians would say the Jews altered the text. The Jews would say the Christians altered the Greek text, and there's no, in terms of obviously I believe one of the two. But historically, it's in terms of a pure objective historical lens, it's ambiguous. These two, the Greek text of the Old Testament and the Hebrew text of the Old Testament don't 95% similar, but there's certain things they don't agree on, and those differences are noteworthy. And the question is, well, which comes first? Wouldn't the Hebrew be the more original one? Well, the oldest Hebrew manuscript we have is 600 years younger than the oldest Greek manuscript we have, which is kind of weird. So it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. But anyway, a lot of this, the vast majority of this type of typology applies to both the Hebrew and the Greek. So you're not worried about missing anything. Like the story of Joseph in Egypt, the story of Moses and the Israelites, that's the same in the Greek and the Hebrew. We're talking about small things, individual passages, individual sections the size of the chapter, but they're not so radically different. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. All right, questions for reflection. Who is the father of the people of Israel? I didn't tell you guys this directly, but let's see if you know.
God.
Yes and no. Abraham. What did God promise him concerning his offspring? Oh, that he would make him the father of many nations. Okay, sorry, I didn't tell you guys this directly. Okay, in what way was the Passover lamb slain at the time of Exodus a foreshadowing of Christ? This I did tell you.
Didn't you tell us about like where they rubbed the blood over the doors and how it would?
Yeah, so the Passover lamb, which was sacrificed on Passover, protected the Israelite firstborn from dying. Likewise, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ protects us from dying. Again, his limited historical event in Christ moves on to a universal event, cosmic event. To whom did God reveal the Ten Commandments and the instructions for proper worship? Moses. What does Israel believe about God that set her apart from other nations?
Yeah.
What?
Only one.
Yeah, only one who's worthy of worship. This is something that trips people up. The Israelites definitely believed in the existence of other deities. It's that they were dangerous and scary, and that they were lesser than the one supreme God of Israel. What does the word prophecy literally mean? To speak forth. How do the prophets foreshadow the work of Christ?
He spoke on behalf of God.
They spoke on behalf of God, and he is the word of God, is uniquely positioned to speak on behalf of God. What is the job of the high priest in the Old Testament? How is this related to work of Christ? I told you about this generally.
Sacrifice Christ, the ultimate sacrifice.
There we go. Perfect. Yeah, and specifically, the high priest atoned for the sins of the people, and that's what he reconciled the people with God, and that's what Jesus did. Anyway, which Old Testament figure is a type or figure of the kingship of Christ? I didn't ask you this either. Okay. David. Yeah, David. That's why Jesus is referred to again and again in the Gospels as the son of David, because he's the successor of David. People say, David was the legitimate king. People look at Matthew's Gospel, which we're going to read one of these Sundays in preparation for Christmas, and say, you have the whole lineage of Jesus leading down to Joseph. And it's like, wait a minute, Joseph was not Jesus' biological father. How does this work? Well, it's showing that Jesus was in line for the kingship. That's the whole point, because you didn't have to be a blood descendant necessarily, but you had to be you could become a king through adoption in the ancient world. That's a very established anyway. But that's what it is. That's why we're going to read the genealogy of Jesus Christ. I think that's next Sunday for our gospel reading, and it's because he is a descendant of David. All right, what is the method of biblical interpretation whereby the history of Israel is interpreted in the light of the coming of Israel's Messiah? Typology. Perfect. Great work. Okay, you guys did it. You knocked it out of the park. All right, I'll say the closing prayer and then dismiss you. Lord, now let your servant depart in peace according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory for your people Israel. God bless all of you. Have a good day. I'll hang around